Hey guys, Drifter here. Welcome back to Fake News 101. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about confirmation bias, which is a fun topic, and this one was an audience recommendation. Confirmation bias is defined as the tendency of people to favor information that confirms or strengthens their beliefs or values. For example, if we support a particular athlete and look up to that person and think that they're well-rounded and accomplished, we are more likely to believe news stories that paint them in a positive light and more likely to discount news stories that are critical of our favorite athlete. Confirmation bias is one of the hardest logical fallacies to defeat because it requires you to constantly challenge your own logic and be aware of your own subconscious sometimes betraying you. This can be doubly challenging if you're deeply entrenched in a niche media ecosystem that exists to constantly reaffirm a bias and never really challenges it. And confirmation bias doesn't just occur within political beliefs or news stories. You can find examples of this in almost every field, including but not limited to science, finance, sports, marketing, art, even interpersonal relationships. There's a lot of aspects of your life that you can let this get the better of you. So let's take a moment to talk about how confirmation bias actually forms. Firstly, it's important to be aware that a lot of these processes are subconscious. This is a sort of built-in, hardwired subconscious mechanism in our brain that, as we'll talk about later in the video, actually helps us learn and navigate the world around us in some circumstances, but can be used against you if you do something like a selective exposure, which refers to the filtering of information, meaning that an individual avoids all information that is challenging or contradictory to their current beliefs. And the best example of this is Continuum magazine. I'll give you a warning, this is a little bit of a wild one. Most of my examples today are really generic and banal and can apply to anything. This is probably the most wild and political one right off the rip. Continuum magazine was published from 1992 to 2001, and it was pretty much an HIV/AIDS denialist magazine. You had a lot of researchers, a lot of doctors and journalists and serious professionals that did not believe that HIV/AIDS, or the epidemic associated with them at the time, was real, and they founded a magazine to promote information, basically poking holes in that theory. The great irony here is that the founder of the magazine and most of its employees would actually eventually pass from HIV-related disorders that they didn't treat because they didn't believe that it was real. And a lot of other people read this magazine, and that is it's a dark example, but it's a selective exposure. They just read the magazine that reaffirms their belief that they don't really have a problem over and over and over again, and they're never really challenged. They don't seek out any contradictory information, or if they get contradictory information, they use it as a prop for criticism to reaffirm their beliefs in a different way. So a little bit of a dark example. Everything else is gonna be a lot more chill. A different way that this can form is a selective perception, which occurs when an individual observes or is exposed to information that conflicts with their already standing beliefs, yet somehow tries to manipulate this information to affirm their own existing views. I'm sure a lot of you have had conversation with friends or maybe relatives where you try to talk good about something and they manage to twist it and turn it into something bad over and over and over again. And the somewhat positive example of this is known as the halo effect. The halo effect is described as when a person forms a positive impression of another person based on one characteristic such that they assume other positive traits about that person without evidence and ignore negative traits. This is a perceptual problem because they can clearly perceive the negative traits, but they choose to ignore them. The best example of this would be your crazy ex that you were head over heels with, that you thought they were the best in the world because maybe they were awesome at one thing and they just got that hook into you and pulled you down. And you, for ages, ignored their negative traits. Perhaps you assigned positive traits to them that they didn't really have because you wanted the relationship to work or because you liked that one positive trait so much, and it probably ended in disaster. So that's a way it can affect your interpersonal relationships. Another way that confirmation bias can form is through selective retention, which is actually a major marketing principle, but that's a little bit of a different video. Selective attention attests that individuals are more likely to remember information that has been presented to them if it is consistent with what they already know to be true. And this is probably the most classic example of confirmation bias, that if you present something that already agrees with all of the information that that person knows and has, they'll usually take it at face value as true and never challenge that belief. This is one that I don't have the best examples for because it tends to happen subconsciously. There's not a lot you can do about it without being very introspective. And the best example that I can think of is sort of the YouTube videos, like the awkward on the street owning people videos where interviews go very, very wrong. The classic example being the Crowder example of Change My Mind, but there's like 1,000 clones and on the street and knockoffs and weird dudes on TikTok that walk around asking people questions. And you see some of these people will give an answer that's silly or dumb in the context of what they're talking about. The interviewer will ask them a very pointed question that points out the flaw in their logic, and you'll kind of see the eyes glaze over a little bit as they take that shock of being wrong and then kind of shake their head and move on like nothing happened. That whole aspect of being wrong, that subconscious pain of being rejected, just gets completely washed and they ignore that. That's the best example I can think of, perhaps a more extreme one than others, but there is a real genuine tendency of human beings to only remember things that affirm their beliefs, which seems kind of crazy to me. Another way confirmation bias can form is if you allow yourself to have a strong emotional reaction to information that confirms your beliefs. Now, this information can be either positive or negative. That's not the important part of it, but rather just how you react to it. If you react very positively, a true affirmation, you feel it in your soul when somebody agrees with you, or you get very negative, angry, hostile when somebody that doesn't agree with you, even just allowing yourself to have those types of emotions can prevent you from critical thinking. And this is most commonly seen when your group is supported or attacked. Obviously, in the context of this, it's news orgs and political groups, but it could be your favorite car manufacturer, your favorite type of food, your favorite kind of sport, your athlete, your religion, just something that you're a part of gets attacked. You have that really strong emotion attached to it. It can skew your perspective. And a simple, fun example would be boomers versus light bulbs and stoves. As many of you now know, the old like incandescent bulbs are being phased out and it's all LED now. And similarly, we're moving to gas stoves. Now, governments decided to do this because LED bulbs are like 100 times more efficient and better for the environment in the long run than incandescent ones. And for the stoves, it has to do with children getting asthma from being exposed to the fumes. But people in the generation that grew up with incandescent bulbs and grew up cooking on gas stoves and really enjoy that, i.e. boomers, see this as an attack on them. They see this as an attack on their identity, that they're being told what to do, that their favorite things are being taken away, and they're not able to separate that emotion, take a step back, and look at it objectively. It's important to note that confirmation bias can affect anyone, regardless of intelligence or education level. Study after study after study seems to confirm that having a higher IQ score or even a high level of education in a particular field does not indicate less confirmation bias than a normal person. Your psychology still works against you here, no matter how well educated you are. And I think the best quote from this is from the physicist Richard Feynman. A lot of great quotes, a lot of great lectures, would tell you to check it out. But Feynman once said, never confuse education with intelligence. You can have a PhD and still be an idiot. And I think most of you understand that in every field, in PhDs and doctors and lawyers and professional fields, in any area, any demographic that you want to pick, there are going to be idiots. And if you're not careful, you might actually find yourself being that idiot, that you could mistake your high IQ and your education for an ability that makes you immune to confirmation bias and other logical fallacies that we'll talk about in the series. But that's simply not true. And I know that I have been the idiot and I have fallen victim to confirmation bias a number of times, and it's frustrating and I feel dumb when it happens, but there are some ways to avoid this. And we're going to start off with these sort of academic recommended ways and then my own personal rules. So firstly, step one is to recognize that confirmation bias is something that happens subconsciously, so it's hard to even notice. And the first step in defeating it is being aware that it can happen to you and being a little bit more aware of yourself and the problematic nature of how your subconscious processes information. Second, because the bias is most likely to occur very early in the decision-making process, we should focus on starting our decision-making process properly, most importantly with the most neutral fact base that we can, and then we try to diversify our information from there on out to get different perspectives. This is not a perfect or flawless thing, but it does help you start from a good place and analyze other perspectives. And then third, You have to search for bias within the information itself, which is probably where we'll pick up on more traditional media literacy. You're looking for bias in sources. You're looking for omitted information, for organizations that are known to have bias, for curious words and descriptors in the writing of the article you're reading, or in my particular favorite, just straight up omitting or wildly spinning some facts that have nothing to do with what's going on in order to make a good story that you can read to have like a good emotional hook to it. So those are the academic ways. I'm going to tell you about my personal rules on confirmation bias, which is if I'm reading something or watching something and it sounds too good to be true, when all of the facts perfectly line up with everything that I understood and fits right in place in my worldview and seems like a good thing, the reality is that thing is probably too good to be true. And when I encounter a fact like this, when I'm too comfortable, when the information has come too easily, I try to take a step back and say to myself that, yeah, this was just way too easy. Then I specifically go search out counterpoints on this information, original sources. We do try to do the neutral fact-based thing. Then I go look for criticisms to see if somebody's going to poke holes in it, right? And then, of course, I try to put all my personal bias aside when doing the research, and I be aware that this may be a confirmation bias type problem, and I need to try to remain neutral and not be emotional about things. And the best example that I can give you about this, we've actually got two examples here near the end. They're both about green energy and recycling. I am a big tree-hugging hippie. I love green tech. I love recycling and solar panels and all that kind of stuff. I have an educational background in it. You've got me hook, line, and sinker on that. I've even got the emotional attachment there after going through years of classes on this nonsense. But I was really excited when my city rolled out all-in-one recycling containers. A lot of cities provide these. They make recycling easy because you can throw a variety of things in there. They don't have to be that clean. They should be. You should clean them, but the facilities will still work either way, and this will be carried off to a facility, sorted, and recycled properly. Well, that's what I believed, and I was really excited about this. And then one day I saw an article about how that's basically a lie and a bunch of these companies just take the recycling to the dump. I didn't want to believe it. I had that negative emotional reaction. I locked down, but I decided to be a big boy and do some real research, to dive in, to find those counterpoints, to find that neutral fact base. And what I discovered was that there was a significant amount of truth to that, and I might be wasting my time with these all-in-one recycling containers because a lot of companies just lie about how they recycle stuff. They just straight up lie, and that's very frustrating, but now I don't dedicate as much effort to sorting the recycling as I used to. Similarly, if something is wildly incongruent with my beliefs, yet very popular, then I take a moment to step back and say, this is a good time to understand why it's popular, why people believe this, why other people are into this. And that usually leads to me checking my own fundamental beliefs about a problem. An example on this one is that Texas has passed a new law that electric vehicle owners have to pay a $200 per year tax called the Electric Vehicle Highway Tax. So if you own an EV, you're paying more taxes than a person who isn't. And that felt very bad. Again, that negative emotional reaction. I'm in Texas. I assumed it had something to do with our relatively conservative support of the oil economy. And I was just all sorts of angry and butthurt about it and had all these negative things to say on social media. But when I looked it up, I discovered that I was actually wrong and that this was popular, that it was a bipartisan bill here in Texas. Both parties passed it nearly unanimously because what was happening is Texas funds its highways through taxes from gas sales. If gas sales go down, we don't have the money to maintain the roads. And as there's more and more EVs, people aren't buying gas. So we have more cars on the road and less money to maintain them. So they had to come up with a solution. It's not a perfect solution, still kind of a little weird here and there. Not my favorite thing, still kind of makes me mad to think about. But I have to admit that the reality is that that was the correct decision for the state, even if I don't like it, even if it feels bad compared to my other beliefs. So, and then finally at the end of this video, I just want to say that confirmation bias is natural in some ways and actually kind of good for us because almost all learning and intuition builds off itself and requires some kind of foundational information. New information that doesn't fit in with what we already know is more likely to be useful than information that doesn't. As a very simple example, it could be for survival or safety. Most of us know that electricity will kill us and it's painful and dangerous, so we shouldn't touch electrical objects that we don't understand. or that animals with big teeth tend to be dangerous. So if you encounter a new type of animal you've never seen before and it's got big teeth, your confirmation bias is that you should leave this alone, and that is the correct decision. Weirdly, some aspects of confirmation bias can also prevent us from going down unhealthy mental rabbit holes. For example, let's talk about flat Earth very briefly. I think they're like my favorite example of something that's wacky and easy to poke holes into. In order to properly research and understand flat Earth, or to accept it as a belief, it would require you to relearn, unlearn, and unbelieve almost every single scientific aspect of your life that's already working. For example, the theory of gravity is flawed. The theory of lenses is flawed. The theory of light is flawed. The theory of space is flawed. A variety of aspects of chemistry and fluid dynamics are also flawed, and Flat Earth will provide you something or some example of how these don't work. But the information that they provide about how something doesn't work, or their alternative theories, aren't necessarily congruent with other examples. So it's not congruent with our reality, and thus our confirmation bias leads us to reject it, and in a way protected us from going down a kind of nonsense path. So it's not all bad. It's necessary. There's a reason our subconscious does this, but it can get the best of you. And that's all for our episode on confirmation bias. I want you to let me know what you think of this episode. I'm still kind of trying to learn how to do this type of content on the fly. I'm very much so experimenting with it. And you can also just suggest a topic for the next episode. This one was an audience suggestion, so if there's something you'd like to hear about next, please do. We're going to go a little bit more academic here and a little bit less picking on specific stories. But if there's a topic you want to talk about, let me know in the comments below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. Drifter out.